So causal pathway analysis is perhaps the scientific term of what is missing, but it's a real understanding of not just the status of resilience, but what drives that forward? What are those factors that drive it to a better state, right? Another, as we just mentioned, is dynamic measurement. It is important, and particularly today, for theoretical as well as practical reasons. It's important to get closer and closer to real-time measurement. The world is changing because of communications technology. And we are in the time of disruptive change, which is very different from what we've lived most of our lives. So if we're going to be effective in this resilience realm, we're going to have to think more and more, out of our comfort zone of surveys and so forth towards dynamic measures and how to identify those and how to harness those for monitoring the resilience of the communities we're concerned about. And then there are measurements of some of the variables that are commonly found in most resilience frameworks that are not really very good yet. And those are some of the areas we'd like, again, you to think about in your groups, and we'd like you to think about critically as you apply some of these quantitative techniques using existing measures. How can we do this better, really? How can we capture these variables that, in fact, the literature is pretty weak on? Now, some are social capital, for example. There are tons of measures out there, and there's a long tradition of measuring it. But it's flat. It's not producing useful information. We know social capital is really important, but most of the time from cross-sectional surveys, the social capital indexes come out pretty weak. We know that's probably not true, right? So it's probably a measurement, and it's probably a construct. We're not thinking about how to capture it properly, and we're not measuring it properly through the cross-sectional survey approaches that we're using. Adaptive capacities, these dynamics that are not easily captured in cross-sectional surveys. What are these dynamics that drive resilience processes that make communities resilient? And psychosocial, not because we don't know how to measure it, because again, there are a lot of measures out there, but because most of the survey programs that we have common cross-sectional survey data for, most of them don't measure psychosocial. That's changing. The multi-indicator cluster survey program that I think many of you are familiar with, but we'll be talking about that in a little while, has started to add them. The DHS, Demographic and Health Survey, has started adding in some countries a question on satisfaction with life for men and women, right? So these are some types of psychosocial measures, but quite frankly, there's still work to be done in those areas. We use the GHQ, the General Health Questionnaire 12 metric, which I think a lot of you are familiar with in the Haiti example, and actually performed well in terms of being pretty discriminatory between resilient and non-resilient groups, camps and non-camps. But that's an area that, again, is underworked and one that you will want to consider, because we think our work at least shows that it's quite important in considering and measuring resilience. And we'll talk really about two important analytical activities, and they're not always, and they're often not linked with the same data sets and with the same approach to analysis. One is to understand what factors contribute and drive resilience, okay? And this is looking at this causal pathway stuff that we just talked about. How do we get a handle on what are those drivers that really facilitate resilience in communities? And that may entail some methodologies. We'll talk later about positive deviance inquiry, case studies, and a number of approaches that perhaps, positive deviance, for example, is looking for cases, be they individuals, households, communities, or that have exhibited resilience when you wouldn't expect to find it there, when the environment is really one of high levels of vulnerability. But there are some families, there are some communities in there that really have got it, right? They're resilient. And so, what distinguishes those? What are the distinguishing factors? And that's an area of inquiry called positive deviance inquiry. And it's also, the flip side is also possible.